Hey everyone, Dave Putz from JKP Holdings here with Peggy from Emerald Palm Investments. So we're doing this interview with Peggy today to discuss buying a loan for the first time and some of the struggles and issues that Peggy had with going through that entire process. She's not a big investor, but she's one of the newer investors that bought just a few loans, and she could touch upon things that she struggled with as a single investor buying loans. So, Peggy, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate you coming on today. And we have a few questions for you. Hopefully, you don't mind, but we want to make sure that you are willing to help others through this process.
Thanks for having me, Dave. I'm happy to share my experience. If it helps somebody else, that's absolutely great.
Awesome. Thanks, Peggy. So, can you give me a little bit of background of how you got into notes and what took place?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm
can
sorry.
you?
Can you repeat the question?
Yep, sure. My internet broke up. I apologize. So, can you share a little bit about how you got into notes and what your background was?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. So, I'm not even sure how I got into notes. I'm like, I was listening to something, and somebody mentioned, Scott Carson, and I think he was doing a workshop that was free to people, a military, past military spouses kind of thing. And so I took that workshop, and that was kind of the beginning of my notes journey, if you will. And from there, we did the Note Camp 101, which led to the fast track, several mastermind events after that. I took some local courses from our local RIA on notes. They had far less of an offering, but they absolutely did have some workshops, and there were a lot of similarities. There were some differences, and it was a little hard to discern which was the right path to travel because of the differences. But it was all still, at that point, I think you want to be exposed to as much information as possible, in that space. So you want to try and be as educated as you can be. I know there's, I have heard people say, just jump in, you know, and while that's all good, fine and well for people who have a much higher risk tolerance, I believe in being educated and having an understanding of what you're getting into and how you're going to manage it before you do that.
Cool. That's awesome. Just for where do you live currently? Where is these REIs that you're going to?
So I'm in Delaware.
Okay.
I'm in Kent
Excellent.
County. We only have 3 counties. We're a small state. But our REI has, they do service all 3 counties. So they have a group for Newcastle
Cool.
and Sussex County. I attend mostly in Newcastle because I live in Newark, which is in Newcastle County.
Wonderful. So you sound like you had some formal trainings, right? How'd you feel without, I'm not bashing any trainings out there, they're all good. Um,
Mhm.
so how did you feel that that prepared you for buying a loan?
So I like to think that a lot of the information was really hugely beneficial, right? Um, but then I will say early on, like especially after I purchased my first note, um, there was a specific structure that you were supposed to go through to get to things that you needed. Like if you needed Polaris, to take on, borrower negotiations to try and get that note back up and running or paying or, negotiate a payoff or whatever the case would be, you had to go through another person. Like there was a connection. Um, and so very early on, I became really leery of this, what I would call kickback structure that had been put in place. And I actually received a phone call, kind of reaming me out because I didn't go through that structure.
Mm,
I jumped over that
gotcha.
connection. And it actually wasn't the case at all. I didn't jump over the connection. I reached out to the connection who never returned my calls or emails. And then I jumped over,
Gotcha.
and made the direct call to the service provider. And so I became leery pretty early on, and that did create some genuine trust issues for me, because it is hard to know who you can trust and who's just taking advantage of an opportunity to make money essentially at your expense. Um,
And as you probably know, this space is very small, right? We're a very small niche of real estate investments. Um, so when you got done with these trainings, did you feel comfortable buying your first loan?
I think for the most part I did. And I understood very clearly that, there is potential for loss. And so I was okay with that. Like I was in a place where I felt confident that, if I needed to take a loss, that I could do so without it being, devastating to me personally or financially.
Did you
Um,
raise money for this, or were you using
I
your own
did
personal?
not. I
Okay.
did not. And I will say that I think, for me, I have a very high level of um in, respect for someone else's money, right? And I would treat their money like I would treat my own money. So if I'm going to jeopardize anything, it's going to be mine first. And then once I feel like I'm in a place where I have really kind of gotten it down, and and I can make it work and be lucrative, then I would be willing to take on
Sure.
someone else's money. Now there was a time, not with my first asset, that was strictly all my money. My second asset, I did have investors, and we took a loss, but I totally owned it, and I took the loss on my end. And in the beginning, our agreement, right? I can't remember what you call it, like a JV agreement. It was like a JV agreement. So the agreement had some language in there which was a little contrary to everything that I had been taught, right? That people just give you their money, and there's no tie, there's no promissory to them, there's no personal liability to them. They understand that there's some level of risk that they could lose their money, so you don't take money from people who obviously don't have it to lose. I don't necessarily agree with that philosophy. Um, but so in this JV agreement, there was some language that said that there was a minimum interest rate that I was agreeing to pay back to the JV investors, and then it said, in addition to that, um, there was um, there was a percentage split. So, and that was very unusual, in all of the education I had been exposed to. It was just, hey, you know, I'm not guaranteeing you anything. There's potential that you could make this kind of money on this kind of a return on the investment, but if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Or you just do a split, that whatever it is, less cost, we split it 50-50 or what have you. So in the beginning, I was very nervous about that, because I kind of felt like, it is someone trying to put me in a position that's not healthy for me to be in. But
Sure.
then after everything, we went through the whole process. We had meetings every week, and we talked about where we were in the process and what was going on. And I felt like I did a really great job of managing the asset from beginning to end. We did take a loss because ultimately the borrower had, it was a duplex. We owned both units in the duplex, but the borrower had literally cut through the adjoining wall in the duplex so that he didn't have to walk out the front door and go over to the other door to get into the other side. So he just cut through the adjoining wall, and the other side had been completely stripped out down to the studs.
Mm,
Um, so there was like no value in the other side at all. And I didn't know until we got till the end of it, after we took it back, that the fact that he had cut that hole in the adjoining wall meant that everything then had to be brought up to code. And to do that, I mean, we had gotten some estimates from some vendors, and to do that was going to be well over $100,000. And there was I didn't have that money,
yeah,
to do that.
it's crazy.
So we did take the loss, but I respected our JV agreement, and I was thankful that minimum percentage rate was in the agreement. And that, and I could absorb that I was comfortable with it. So they did get their 10% in proceeds for lending their funds to the, to the
It's a deal.
yeah, to the deal.
Okay.
Um, and I do believe that, if you're going to be in this space, you have to be that kind of person. You have to have that kind of integrity about you.
So
To,
with that said, I know that you did a few different training programs out there, and you found them helpful. Would you have bought a deal without training programs, or would you recommend anyone doing that?
I would never buy a deal without having had some kind of training
Okay.
or been exposed to it on some level. No. As a matter of
So
fact, I mean, I think through the training, I was even subjected to other types of investing options,
okay,
like subject to investing,
cool,
which I have done and I have been much more successful with.
cool. What part
So
of the what we were talking before camera? What what are some of the things that you feel that are missing with trainings out there that investors should learn before getting into the space that's maybe not taught or not expressed as gratefully as it should be?
right. So, I mean, obviously there is a lot to learn and to know. And I don't can't say that I think any one training program captures everything. Um, it's not the intent of the training program to literally take you by the hand and educate you on absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know in this space. Um, but you should have some general sense and knowledge of real estate, of money and finance, just in general. To take on this kind of journey,
You
so that you
mentioned
understand what's
you mentioned
happening as it's
before
happening.
the recording that one of the things that you wish you learned better was a calculator.
Absolutely. So there are so many components to note investing, right? I mean, when you go to the training, it kind of makes it looks a little simplistic in the sense that, here's your purchase price, here's $1,500 for foreclosure cost, here's $1,000 for, third party negotiator or something like that. That's not what they called it, but and this is your net and here's your ROI. It's just not that simple. There is so much more involved, and you need to know what those things are so that you can prepare for them and put something in your spreadsheet to give you a baseline for what you can anticipate your ROI to be, given all of those ancillary costs.
Would you
Because
say
there's a
that's
lot of expense associated with notes.
would you say that's probably the key item that you need to know as an investor that may be missing in some courses, but that's the key item?
I would say that by far is the most important thing to know and understand, because that's where everything goes awry once you've secured your asset, and made your purchase. Then all of the expenses start kicking in, and if you don't know that to expect them, and to account for them, they can have dramatic, effects on your bottom line.
So if you bid 55% of UPB because that sounds good,
Right.
that's a trouble.
Not a good strategy.
Yeah, I agree, right? Even sometimes being 80% of UPB can be a terrible thing, right? And I know I've
Yeah.
spoken about that. Um, how did you handle the due diligence? Like, how did you go about looking at the loan and or the loans? What did you do? Did you hire someone? Did you look at Zillow? What did you typically do?
So I certainly did all of the things that I, as an investor, could do, right? Go out to Google Maps and street view the property and have somebody do a drive by the property, get a BPO on the property to kind of get, some estimated value for what's going on in the market, for a property that has that many numbers of bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage and all that happy stuff. But I'll also say that, I mean, you do three estimates, right? Your Zillow, your, appraisal, and all of those things, against a BPO. But I will say that there's in this space, there's, especially in the lower level assets, right? There's just a lot to say for those BPOs and those online appraisal values, they're just not, they're not enough. They're not, they're just, they don't contribute the reality that you need to know and understand about what you're going to be dealing with if you make that purchase.
So
So, obviously look at other things, like how many payments are left, versus, what you'll get back, if those payments
sure.
are all made. But you should also, I think, factor in some kind of loss on those payments because most borrowers don't make all the payments
Yeah.
they're supposed to make, you know.
So you mentioned, the part of valuing the property. How about reviewing the collateral and understanding the state timelines?
hmm So I have been personally subjected to a bit of legal background. So I did understand a lot of that. The one component that I never really appreciated was the value of an allonge, right? So the assignment, that's pretty understandable. But the allonge was like, yeah, I don't really understand, what the value of that is. And I actually caught into some trouble because I didn't understand that.
Yes.
The seller of an asset, said, "Oh, well, that these documents aren't needed anymore, so we don't need to provide them to you when you purchase this file." And in fact, according to the legal system, they are still very much required.
Yeah.
So, in my most recent note purchase, which I still have, I had to go back and pay somebody years later to go back and try and get signatures for allonges and assignments that were missing from the file. But we absolutely used, as part of our due diligence, we used all of the providers, the service providers that are out there, the Polarises, the Richmond Monroe for file storage, collateral review, chain
So
review.
you didn't review your own collateral. You hired
I
outside
did not.
sources.
Yeah, I paid somebody to do all of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I
So
felt like, and you should feel like if that's the business that they're in,
yep,
that you can be pretty confident that you're getting good advice
at
back.
least better
Um,
than you would review it yourself.
but yes, but that's not always true.
This is true.
People make mistakes.
Yes.
People are human, and as a result of that, even the best laid plans, are subject to go awry.
So the next step is to find a servicer. How'd you pick a servicer?
For me, it was I really tried to focus on, the less change, the better, right? So I wanted to stay with the current servicer, if that was possible. And sometimes it wasn't until after, I mean, even if you ask, will the servicer take the file? And, if you get yes, and then you make the purchase, and then you find out after the fact, oh, well, yeah, servicers changed their, protocol and they don't do single files anymore. So now I have to go find somebody else, and that created some delays in the transfer time, which also then created delays in receiving the payments. Like there were payments I didn't get because the file didn't get transferred. So the seller kept those payments, which then affected my ROI. And
Yeah.
I fought like the dickens to get them back, and there I was not getting them back.
So that would be found typically in the purchase sale agreement on what the cutoff date should be, if you're aware that there's a cutoff date for
There
payment.
was no cutoff date in the agreement.
Mm.
Yeah,
Okay, lesson
but I
learned.
mean, like, it's a lesson learned, right? We
Yep,
all learn the
lesson
hard
learned.
way.
Another key item from the talk, right? It's
Yeah.
crucial to get your calculator set up, getting the numbers in there, and make sure you have a due date, a cutoff date on your purchase sale agreement. You looked at hundreds of loans, I'm sure, right? If not more. How'd you choose the ones you did?
So I mean, so I kind of like going into note investing. I kind of had predetermined in my own mind, right? How much financial exposure I wanted to put out into the world in this journey. And so that is essentially the foundation for the choices that I made, along with, anticipated value for the assets, along with the projected ROI. Again, not having, clearly identified all of those ancillary expenses that were going to come along. And the one thing I will say I found to be the weakest is the expenses. Like in all of the training, the expenses are, I think, reduced, right? Like they're small numbers. but they really add up to big numbers
Mhm.
once you get your asset and you start working through that process. Legal fees can, I mean, attorneys are not cheap. And I tell people all the time, nobody works for free, right?
Yeah, no.
So they add up quickly. Your storage fees add up, and every time you need to touch a document or look at a document or have them send you a document, it's $100, $100, $100, and I mean, after a while, you're in, a grand or better. So those fees add up really, really fast, and they do affect your bottom line.
Did you
So
pick
having,
did you pick a note based on state at all or location or based on numbers?
um, I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Did you pick a note? Did you the notes you
So
chose to
yes,
buy? Did you say
yes.
I want to buy in Florida, or was the location a big factor in that? The price obviously was,
So
but
location was more important to me, right? Um, you hear all of these other investors out there, they're traveling to Georgia and traveling to Chicago and traveling to all these places to check on their investment. That's another huge expense, right? And I didn't want to have to incur that. So for me, it was more important to focus on assets that were closer to home. Number
mm,
one, because if they're in my state, I know the laws in my state, so I kind of feel like I have a leg up, if you will. Or I actually purchased one in Pennsylvania. The other one that I have is in Michigan. So they weren't all in Delaware, but I started with two that were very close in proximity to where I live so that I could reasonably travel there in a day's time by car, to assess it myself, to deal with property preservation after it had been, taken back, and things of that nature.
so when you picked the Michigan and PA, what were the factors, without getting too detailed, why choose that loan over other loans that you looked at? Was it numbers? Was it value of property? What about those loans attracted you?
So I think for the most part, they were the closest to me, right? In
For the
all of the
Michigan
tapes that I
one.
had reviewed, it
Okay.
was more about proximity. So there aren't a lot of Delaware assets that you can buy in the market. And so that was probably the most attractive thing for me, was that this particular asset was very close to me. It
But
gave
how
me
about the
the ability.
Michigan one? How about that Michigan one that you mentioned before?
So that's after I
Yeah. So what
that
made
was
you,
supposed to be a very that was supposed to be like the easiest note purchase of my life.
but why choose that one versus the other one? What about that one was attractive for you?
Because that one was a note that already had an established history of payment.
Gotcha.
So
Performance.
it was just supposed to be an investment for a return, and nothing more, was supposed to be involved in that. And it has not worked out that way.
History does not always repeat itself.
Yes, it does.
So it what were some of I know we talked about the calculator being a huge factor. What other issues were you not prepared for? You mentioned cost, fees that you weren't expecting. Um, the, was any part of the process something you were not expecting?
Um, so we'll call it red tape for lack of a better answer, right? Um, it was it was increasingly frustrating. Um, it just seemed like at every turn there was a hurdle that had to be overcome. And you make the phone calls, you have the conversations, then there's like you have to call. One of the things that you need to do is you need to understand whether or not there are any fines on the property, are there any judgments on the property. So working through calling like the local municipalities that the home is located in to find those things out, and not being the person with who owns the document, right,
Yeah,
that owns the property, creates a conflict because they don't want to just give out information to the general public. So that was a hardship. Finding a way to overcome that
yeah.
um, was a challenge. And then of course, even like working with the borrower, there was this, like, I think was it a CFPB says you're not
Mhm.
supposed to have direct contact with the borrower, but a lot of people were doing it. And and I did it too, right? After once Polaris had kind of established contact, and we had some initial agreements in place that they were going to make some initial payments, which I thought were going to put me on the positive end of my ROI, ended up killing me, because what I didn't know, like I said, trying to call the local authorities to get information, this guy had $1,500 in back utility costs and sewer bills that had to be paid, and it ruined the whole deal.
Did you pull an O&E for it before you bought it? Did you pull an O&E from like
We did,
what?
but those things don't show up on there. They do not show up on there. So you have to think outside of the box and make those phone
Mhm.
calls and get that information. So I think, like, one of the things that maybe I would do today, right, that I didn't know or do then, was potentially have my attorney's office use their title company to get that information, instead of trying to get it yourself and encountering all of that frustration and stress of not being able to get the information you need, to move the file in a forward direction.
When we first bought our loan, we talked before. I hem and hawed. I lost some deals just because I got nervous. How many deals did you like that you missed on due to being nervous? How many loans did you miss out on? Do you feel,
In
or were you not
evaluating
nervous?
the tape, you could probably say a lot, right? Because there were a lot of deals on the tape. And you're supposed to have a strategy for, for streamlining the ones that you want to focus on. So obviously the ones that are proposed to have greater ROIs, are the ones that you focus on first, and then you kind of work your way down from there. So I, in theory, I missed out on a lot, but given my already predetermined budget, for this journey, my comfort level with how far away the asset could be from where I was personally located to manage cost was the second. So I really had already identified, where the focus had to be right from the beginning. So I don't feel like I felt really excited when I won the assets, right? When I was awarded the assets that I bid on, that was very exciting because it was everything that I had expected. It was close by, it was going to be manageable, it had an estimated good ROI on it. Um, so I would say that I didn't feel like I lost
Okay.
any deal,
Did
because
you
everything
feel?
I could have bid in. There was one property that I bid on that they just absolutely refused me. I bid on it over and over and over again, like and they just kept coming back and saying no, 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 no. But there was no way to see the house, like the front of the house. It wasn't on Google Maps. You couldn't get it anywhere. And I just said, you know what? I'm not doing that. I'm not going to
Yeah,
invest any more money in a property I can't physically even see a picture of.
yeah.
So I don't think I really lost out on any, considering those things.
Any deals you have nervousness over, like you passed on because you just were nervous and not sure, and you just nerves carried it all? I mean, a lot of
Well,
people
that one
nerves.
was for
Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
right? That property, the one I could not get. So there were two. There was that one, that I could not get a photo of the house,
okay.
and then there was a second one, which was in Danville, Virginia. Looked really super great online, Google Images. We actually called a relative who lives nearby
Nice.
and sent the relative on a drive-by, and the relative was like, "Yeah, no, you don't want to do that."
That's awesome. So it
So we
sounds to
did
me as you
we did
were, it sounded to me that notes weren't nervousness for you. You didn't have a nerve where you're like, you were hem and hawed. Analysis by paralysis didn't affect you, which is great. For those who have that analysis of paralysis, would you recommend anything for them or suggest anything for them to help them get through that?
So I think that really goes back to understanding an ROI calculator, having one prepared, understanding all of the elements that will come into play or could potentially come into play, and their estimated cost factors. Um, because I mean, the numbers are the numbers,
Yes.
right? Um, They like to say numbers don't lie, and
Yeah.
they don't if you account for them. I
Yes.
think most people get into trouble because they don't account for those expenses, and then that's where things really start to fall apart.
We've seen a lot of investors tell us, well, I don't use a calculator. I cringe when I hear that.
I would too,
Yeah.
for
Um,
sure.
there are certain things I can calculate in my head, but I'd rather not, especially deal with money and deals.
Mhm.
Um, do you want, with any of these deals, what were the property values of the deals you did buy? Well, give me the first two you bought. What was the value of the property? And what,
Um,
I'm presuming you bought first.
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I know the first one that I bought, I purchased it for just over $20,000. It was anticipated to have, I think, a 30 plus $1,000 value. Um, and then there were some investors who also knew the area who were like, oh yeah, wow, that's going to go for $100,000 and blah, 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 blah. And of course that turned out not to be the case. After I took it back, it's in a neighborhood that is, or literally, it's located right next to a very hot zone in the city. Um, so that was a deterrent, right? It was fine for investors who do like Section 8 investments in the city, and keep those properties for rentals. I did end up selling it, but I took like a $10,000 loss on it when I sold it, because it was, because of all the costs, not because of the purchase price. The purchase price was fine. I sold it for $29,000, but like I had so much money, invested in the expense of taking it back, and those liens and utility charges that were not known on the front end, just really ate it all up.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing information. It's always good to hear different stories from a different perspective. You're not a hedge fund, you're not a private equity fund. Your investor got involved out of interest.
Mhm.
And in this field is confusing and it's hard to get into because of the confusion. Trainings do give you some help, but I do agree. You gotta trust your numbers and trust your due diligence.
Yeah.
And that's scary stuff. So,
Hmm.
Peggy,
Yeah. I would
I
add.
appreciate you sharing with us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I appreciate you sharing this information
Oh,
with us too.
absolutely. I think that one other thing that I think has the most value, aside from the ROI understanding and the calculator and the expenses and proposed things that could come into play and affect you
Sure.
financially, that's like by far the most important. But second important is just know yourself, right? Know
Mm,
your tolerance for the different types of situations that you're going to have to deal with. Are you able to deal with, you know complicated people, complicated borrowers, because you are going to find yourself in, very rigid, relations, with them, in dealing working through that whole process. So do you have the heart for that? Do you have the
yeah.
stomach for that, for taking back a property, from someone, um, and for dealing with the state of that property once
Mhm.
you have it, because it could be anything. I mean, I kind of feel like my experiences were a little on the lighter end of the conditions that, have been experienced in this space with the lower level assets than others that have shared that I'm aware of. I mean, everything from human waste to, just being gutted and,
Yeah.
not, and needing to be completely rehabbed and brought up to code, which would be a very expensive thing to do. So if you can get somebody inside that property before you purchase it, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's absolutely huge. Most Many people probably cannot, because it requires someone who's willing to go in there and say, "Hey, I work for the insurance company, and we're here to evaluate your home," for the new buyer, even if they don't work for the insurance company.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. It's a legal side of it.
Yeah.
Well, Peggy, I really appreciate you coming on with me, sharing some of your insights, sharing your experience from a different perspective than we are used to. I'm glad you jumped into this opportunity with us. And we look forward to speaking again with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate the ability to share. I hope it's helpful to someone in some way. And thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.